Thank you. While we are awaiting the mayor, I think we can proceed to have our keynote speaker. Walden Bello, to most of us, is of course the Walden Bello, who have always been known as a political and intellectual activist against the current model of economic globalization. One author referred to him as the one who invented the new word, and that is the word deglobalization. Hello, Alden. During the martial law regime of President Marcos, he was a key figure in the international movement to restore democracy in the Philippines. For his efforts to bring attention to the human rights abuses in the Philippines, he was jailed by the U.S. authorities for leading the non-violent, an emphasis on the non-violent, takeover of the Philippine consulate in San Francisco. In 1995, he co-founded the Focus on the Global South, a policy research institute based in Bangkok, to challenge neoliberalism, militarism, and corporate-driven globalization. Walden campaigned for the withdrawal of U.S. military bases in the Philippines, Okinawa, and Korea, and also called for the denuclearization and demilitarization of the Asian region. He is a committed environmentalist, having been chair of the Greenpeace Southeast Asia. Now, alongside his activism, Walden also has a distinguished academic career, having taught at the University of California, Berkeley, UC Irvine, and UC Santa Barbara, as well as the University of the Philippines. I remember he was also a lecturer at Miriam at one point. His books on globalization are used extensively by our students in the Philippines as well as in other countries for its sharp critique and analysis of the world capitalist system. Mr. Bello is currently a member of the Parliament in the Philippines, where he is chairperson of the Committee on Migrant Workers. One of his most significant work is the fact-finding visit he made to Saudi Arabia, where he exposed the abject conditions of Filipino domestic helpers. It so angered the Saudi Arabian government that they threatened to cut off all their recruitment of Filipino domestic workers. That's how strong and how clear the message was in his report. So it is my pleasure and honor to welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Walden Bello, Congressman Walden Bello.
Good morning, Mr. Gutierrez, Commissioner De Dios, President Rosario Lapus, Vice President Rose Bautista, William Goyce, Ellen Sana, and good morning to all of you delegates. I would like, first of all, to congratulate Miriam College, the Migrant Forum of Asia, the Center for Migrant Advocacy, and all the other organizations that have put together this historic World Social Forum on Labor Migration 2012. I think William has already shown the breadth and diversity of organizations that are represented here today, from migrant workers organizations, labor unions, labor federations like the CAISA, the peasant organizations, including the foremost Global Federation, Via Campesina, and so many other advocacy groups here. Also, we find in our midst parliamentarians from all over South and Southeast Asia, including a special delegation that has come from Palestine. And we declare our solidarity with the Palestinian people. And we even have a parliamentarian representative of President Correa, who is with us here today. Assemblyist Moscosa, I believe, Linda Moscosa. And so it is a really a very broad and very diverse gathering, all united around promoting migrant rights. So this gathering takes place at a time of great stresses and strains to the global economy, a condition that poses great dangers and challenges to migrant communities. The topic of my talk here today is labor trafficking as the new slave trade. The freer flow of commodities and capital has been one of the features of the contemporary processes of globalization. Unlike in the earlier phase of globalization in the 19th century, however, the freer flow of commodities and capital has not been accompanied by a freer movement of labor globally in the current phase of globalization. After all, the centers of the global economy, both the old sites of accumulation like Europe and the United States, and the dynamic new sites like the Gulf states, have imposed ever greater restrictions on migration from the poorer countries. Yet, the demand for cheap labor in the richer parts of the world continues to grow, even as more and more people in developing countries seek to escape conditions of economic stagnation and poverty that are often the result of the same dynamics of a system of global capitalism that have created prosperity in the developed world. The number of migrants worldwide has grown from 36 million in 1991 to around 250 million today, and even that is said to be an underestimate. The aggregate numbers do not, however, begin to tell the critical role that migrant labor plays in the prosperous economies. For instance, the booming economies in the Persian Gulf and Saudi Peninsula are relatively lightly populated in terms of their local Arab population, but they host a substantial number of foreign migrant workers, many of whom come from South Asia and Southeast Asia. Indeed, foreign migrant workers are a disproportionate part of the populations of the Persian Gulf states, ranging from 25% in Saudi Arabia to 66% in Kuwait to over 90% in the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. This gap between increasing demand and restricted supply has created an explosive situation, one that has been filled by a global system of trafficking in human beings that can in many respects be compared to the slave trade in the 16th century. The dynamics of the current system of trade in repressed labor is illustrated in the case of the Philippines. This country is one of the great labor exporters of the world, some 10% of its population, and 22% of its working age population are now migrant workers in other countries. With remittances totaling over $20 billion a year, the Philippines places fourth as a recipient of remittances after India, China, India, and Mexico. The country's role as a labor exporter cannot be divorced from the dynamics of neoliberal capitalism. The labor export program began in the mid-70s as a temporary program under the Marcos dictatorship, with a relatively small number of workers involved, some 50,000. The ballooning of the program to encompass some 9 million workers owes much to the devastation of the economy and jobs by the structural adjustment policies imposed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, beginning in 1980. Trade liberalization under the World Trade Organization, and the prioritization of debt repayment by the post-Marcos governments in national economic policy since 1986. Structural adjustment resulted in deindustrialization and the loss of so many manufacturing jobs. Trade liberalization pushed so many peasants out of agriculture, a great number directly to overseas employment. And the prioritization of debt repayments robbed government of resources for capital expenditures that could have acted as an engine of economic growth, since some 20 to 40% of the budget was allocated yearly to servicing the debt. In the role that structural adjustment and trade liberalization played in creating pressures for labor migration, the experience of the Philippines parallels that of Mexico and another key labor exporting country. For the governments of the two countries as well, massive labor export has served another function, which is that of serving as a safety valve for the release of social pressures that would otherwise have been channeled into radical movements for political and social change internally. Those who migrate are often among the most intrepid, nimble, and sharp people in the lower and middle classes, the kind of people who would make excellent cadres and members of progressive movements for change. Along with the crisis of socialization of children owing to the absence of the mother and father, this is one of the most damaging legacies of the massive labor migration in the Philippines that has allowed our elites to ignore long overdue structural reforms. Labor export is big business, having spawned a host of parasitic institutions that now have a vested interest in maintaining and expanding it. The transnational labor network includes labor recruiters, government agencies and officials, labor smugglers, big corporate service providers like the United States multinational service provider Aramark, and the United States Department of Defense. What is actually happening is the expansion of a system of labor trafficking that is just as big and as profitable as sex trafficking and the drug trade. The spread of free wage labor has often been associated with the expansion of capitalism. But what is currently occurring is the expansion and institutionalization of a system of unfree labor under contemporary neoliberal capitalism, a process not unlike the expansion of slave labor and repressed labor in the early phase of global capitalist expansion in the 16th century that was pointed out in the work of sociologists like Immanuel Wallerstein. This expansive system that creates, maintains, and expands unfree labor is best illustrated in the case of the Middle East. As Atiya Ahmad writes, and I quote, "With the booming of the Gulf states' petrodollar-driven economies from the early 1970s onwards, a vast and consolidated assemblage of government policies, social and political institutions, and public discourse developed to manage and police the region's foreign resident population. Anchored by the kafala or sponsorship and guarantorship system, This assemblage both constructs and disciplines foreign residents into quote-unquote temporary labor migrants. This elite-promoted construction of migrant identity promotes an internalization of the migrants' role as social subordinates and an emasculation of their status as political agents. They are expected to remain, and so far have largely behaved as non-participants in the politics of their host societies, even as these societies are swept by the winds of the Arab Spring. In 2009, some 64% of the more than 1 million Filipino workers that went abroad went to the Middle East. Most of these workers were women, and the biggest occupational category was household service workers. Here is how the labor trafficking system works in the states in the Arabian Peninsula along the Persian Gulf. 1. A recruiter from a Gulf state contacts his man in the Philippines. 2. The Filipino contact goes to the remote provinces to recruit a young woman, promising a wage of 400 pesos a month, which is the minimum set by the Philippine government. 3. When she departs, the recruiter gives her another contract at the airport, one that is often written in Arabic, saying she will be paid only half or less that amount. 4th, upon arrival in her destination, she is provided by the Gulf recruiter with a temporary residence permit or ikama, but this is taken from her along with her passport by the recruiter or by the employer. 5th, she is turned over to a family where she labors under slave-like conditions, being expected to work 18 to 20 hours a day. 6th, it is common that among the services expected of her is to minister to the sexual needs of the master of the house, which creates an unbearable situation, not only because refusal often brings a big beating, but also because this brings her into conflict with the wife. 7, she is isolated from other Filipino domestic workers, making her communication with the outside world dependent on her employer. 8, she cannot leave the employer because her temporary residence certificate and passport are with him. If she runs away, however, and goes to the labor recruiter, she is quote-unquote sold to another family, sometimes at an even lower rate than that paid by the original employer. 9th, unable to leave the country since she has no documents, the runaway must often ends up being sold from one family to another by the labor recruiter. 10th, if she is lucky, she might find her way to the Philippine Embassy, which operates a shelter for runaways, but it will take months, if not years, for the Philippine Embassy to be able to obtain the necessary permits from the host government that would enable her to return home. In its effort to curb this free market in virtual slavery, or to prevent workers from going into countries where their physical security would be in great danger, like Afghanistan or Iraq, the Philippine government requires government-issued permits for workers to be able to leave, or it has imposed deployment bans to some countries. However, labor recruiters, which are often in cahoots not only with Middle East employers, but also with the U.S. Defense Department and U.S. private contractors, have found ways of getting around these regulations. There have developed clandestine networks to smuggle workers from the southern Philippines to destinations in the Middle East. A number of women, domestic workers, I was able to interview in Damascus when I was there a few months ago, told of being smuggled out of the southern Philippine city of Zamboanga by small boat to the Malaysian state of Sabah. From there, they were transported in the hold of a bigger boat going to Singapore, where they were then offloaded and brought by land transport to a site near Kuala Lumpur. In Kuala Lumpur, they were forced to work for their subsistence for 6 weeks. It was only after 2 months that they were finally transported by plane from Kuala Lumpur to Dubai, then to Damascus, where they found themselves in the middle of a civil war. If this sounds much like a route traveled by Indiana Jones, it is. though what they experience is not adventure but hell. With such illegal transnational human smuggling networks in operation, it is not surprising that of the 9,000 domestic workers in Syria earlier this year, the embassy estimated that 90% of them were there illegally. That is, they had no valid exit papers from the Philippines. Among other things, this has made locating them and contacting them very difficult after Manila issued orders to the embassy last January to evacuate all Filipino workers in Syria owing to the spreading civil war. When I was there in my capacity as chairman of the Committee on Overseas Workers Affairs of the House of Representatives in March of this year, I joined the Philippine Embassy Rapid Response Team headed by Ambassador Endaya, searching for Filipino domestics caught up in civil war in the city of Homs. We were unable to locate anyone or even to verify how many of our OFWs had died as we traveled through that city's shattered blocks, though we had been told that hundreds of domestics were trapped in the fighting. With a strong interest in presenting a facade of stability to the world, the Syrian government did not cooperate in our search. In fact, it did not even give us a permit to go to Homs, making our mission there an illegal one, for which we could have been arrested and perhaps tried as spies. And believe you me, you do not want to be arrested by Assad's minions. This slide shows Alma Giao. She is a Filipino domestic worker who transported by taxi out of Homs about 25 of her OFWs, risking her life in the process over a period of about 3 weeks. And Alma, when she was asked why she did it, she said that despite the fact that 25 times she risked bullets and bombs, she said, well, you know, it was the only decent thing to do if your compatriots were in trouble. Alma received an award of distinction from the Philippine House of Representatives for her heroism, and indeed she is known as the Filipina heroine of Homs. Very much. And typifies the heroism of our OFWs. The situation is similar in Afghanistan and Iraq. For much the same reason, we do not have an accurate figure of how many Filipinos have been illegally recruited to be service workers in the U.S. bases by the Pentagon and the U.S. military contractors. But 10,000 is perhaps a conservative number. In the case of Afghanistan, the collusion between illegal labor traffickers, the United States government, and U.S. private contractors poses a gargantuan challenge to the weak Philippine state. The predominance of women among the workers being trafficked to the Middle East has created a situation rife with sexual abuse, a system whereby labor trafficking and sex trafficking are increasingly intersecting. Here is an excerpt from a report of the House Committee on Overseas Workers following the visit of some members to Saudi Arabia that I led in January 2001, and which Commissioner De Dios has already mentioned drew the ire of the Saudi government. Quote, rape is the ever-present specter that haunts Filipino domestic workers in Saudi Arabia. Rape and sexual abuse are more frequent than the raw embassy statistics reveal, perhaps coming to 15 to 20% of cases reported for domestics in distress. If one takes these indicators as roughly representative of unreported cases of abuse of domestic workers throughout the kingdom, then one cannot but come to the conclusion that rape and sexual abuse is common. I would go further and say that there is a strong element of sex trafficking in the trafficking of Filipino women into the Middle East, and aspects that they do not know about, when they are recruited, given the expectation, especially in many Gulf households, that providing sex to the master of the household is seen as part of the domestic workers' tasks. I would suggest that those who would like to read the horrors that are associated with sexual abuse and rape of domestic workers in Saudi Arabia, that the report, The Dark Kingdom, the condition of Filipino overseas workers in Saudi Arabia is available in the internet. People can in fact access that. And there are in fact very brief descriptions or summaries of that report that are available here today that you can see. And oftentimes, these stories have a sad ending. In those cases where the OFW musters the courage to be able to report what happens to the Saudi authorities, very few of those cases in fact go to prosecution, and a very minute number indeed results in the punishment of the perpetrators. In our trip to Saudi Arabia, we documented 4 cases of rape and gang rape, and it is sad to say that of those 4 cases that we have really followed up over the last 2 years, none of them have in fact resulted in the effective punishment of the perpetrator, except perhaps in one case where they were jailed for a few months and then they were released. The victims in all of these cases did not get justice. In fact, they were not even given monetary settlements, and indeed, most of them have now come home poorer than when they left the Philippines. Indeed, this was a horror story of the first degree. Let me sum up the key points of this presentation so far. The creation of the labor export economy in countries like the Philippines stemmed greatly from the impact of structural adjustment, trade liberalization, and the prioritization of debt repayment, policies that led to deindustrialization, the erosion of local agriculture, and the gutting of state investment, disabling it as an engine of growth. Labor export became a safety valve, draining the country of forces that could have contributed to political movements and allowing the elite to keep on postponing much-needed structural reforms. The dynamics of neoliberal capitalism have led to the creation of a global system of labor trafficking, reinforcing the insight of Immanuel Warren's theme that the development of capitalist relations of production does not, in many cases, displace, but it reinforces or promotes the spread of unfree labor. This includes not only the new centers of capital accumulation like the Middle East, but indeed also old centers like the United States. And I would just like to say here that labor trafficking to the United States is getting worse every year. I just was in the US last year, investigating the case of 11 traffic workers to Los Angeles. And indeed, the US authorities have classified their case as a case of labor trafficking. And this is becoming more and more frequent. And US transnational corporations like Aramark are very much involved in it. So this is not just something that happens in the Middle East. This is something that also happens in the United States and Europe. With a great number, indeed in the case of the Philippines, the majority of migrant workers being women, rape and sexual abuse has become a central element in the system of unfree labor, in particular in labor trafficking in the Gulf states. Slavery is said to be a thing of the past. However, the dynamics of global capitalism have reproduced a system of repressive labor globally that is serviced and maintained by legal and illegal labor trafficking. Female domestic workers are at the bottom of the migrant social hierarchy in places like the Middle East. Their conditions of work, which often include rape and sexual abuse, constitute a condition virtually indistinguishable from slavery. As was the case with traditional slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries, abolition of this system of repressed, unfree labor must be high on the agenda of the 21st century. A key part of the solution, of course, is to restructure our economies so that we can create the decent jobs at home that would make it unnecessary for great numbers of our people to go abroad in search of work. This task would entail ending the neoliberal policies that have eroded our industrial sectors and our agriculture. It would mean completing land reform in our countries and other asset redistribution measures that address poverty and promote equity. It would include measures that advance women's health, reduce poverty, and bring about development such as the reproductive health bill in the case of the Philippines. But even as we reform our domestic economy, we must protect our migrant workers and advance their rights and interests as they labor abroad to sustain their families at home, and in the process, keep the domestic economy above water. As advocates of migrant workers, we have huge tasks ahead of us. Yet, over the years, we have made progress. We now have a global network of activist organizations working for migrant rights. We also have increasing numbers of scholars and research institutes dedicated to illuminating the migrant condition. A number of our governments have, under the pressure of both migrant workers and their citizens, institutionalized social services, legal services, and even the beginnings of a social protection system for their overseas workers. In the receiving or host countries, the rights of migrants are now championed by concerned citizens, political parties, and even some progressive governments. This is especially critical in Europe and the United States today, as the economic crisis in these areas creates the conditions for scapegoating migrants, as we have seen in Southern Europe, in Greece, and in the United States, in places like the state of Arizona. Among the sending countries, parliamentary groups, among them the Asian Interparliamentary Caucus on Labor Migration, whose representatives are here today, are increasingly talking about coordinating their efforts to defend and advance the rights of their workers abroad. This may eventually lead to a common front among sending countries so that they may counter the tactics of some receiving countries to pit them against each other in their search for cheap labor. Having said this, we must nonetheless admit that we have quite a distance to go in furthering the rights and welfare of migrants. I am confident that the World Social Forum on Migration 2012 will be a milestone in this process. As we begin our work, let us be inspired by the World Social Forum slogan, "Another world is possible." That was the last slide. What happened to the last slide? Thank you very much. I would like to extend to all of you, of course, the welcome from the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Feliciano Belmonte. Thank you very much.
Maraming salamat. Thank you in Filipino, Walden, for that great speech. I hope you can all have a copy before this conference leaves. At this point, we still do not have the mayor with us. So maybe I call on Helen to give a tribute and a moment of silence to honor and acknowledge those who have dedicated their lives to the human rights of migrants.
Thank you and good morning, dear participants. I'm Hildegard Hagemann from the German Commission for Justice and Peace. And after this inspiring and impressive and revealing speech presentation of Mr. Bello, I am here to give tribute. Because we are gathered here to acknowledge and address all the injustice which are barriers in front of us, in front of our governments, and in the world. So let us give tribute at the beginning of our gathering here to the truth of the migrant people and the advocates who work to create a world respecting all human beings, no matter where they come from. We honor those fleeing from violence in all its forms, here and everywhere, known or hidden, in war, on borders, at sea, unjustified by anyone. Let us specifically give tribute to around 100 migrant workers, mostly migrant workers, who died today in a burning garment factory in Bangladesh due to lack of security and safety conditions. We grieve the violence migrants and their defenders have suffered and still suffer. We grieve the deaths of the innocent. We grieve injustices between the powerful and the defenseless, the rich and the poor, between men and women, adults and children, in homes or in streets, in workplaces or schools. We grieve personal violence and we grieve institutional violence. So let us now remember all those who have fought for justice and dedicated their lives to create a positive future for all people. Please stand up with me now and join in 1 minute of silence. Please be seated. The organizers have put up a wall of tribute also in the exhibition hall. And please honor the advocacy heroes of the world by writing their names on this tribute wall in the exhibition hall, by pinning mementos and decorating the cloth so that together we remember them throughout the whole week of the World Social Forum on Migration. And now at the end of the opening, let us remember and confirm also that we can and we will challenge all that sustains fear and invites injustice. And we will and can lift up equity in our search for justice. We will walk together, footsteps together uniting all human beings. Let us go from here with determination to diminish injustices and create a world of sharing, of dialogue, understanding, and action. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Before our tea break, I'd just like to run you over our program for today. At at this time, we should be having our coffee break, which will be outside of the Marian Auditorium. At 11 a.m., we will have the first plenary, Crisis, Critique, and Consequences of Global Migration, Resistance, Organization, and Action, here at the Marian Auditorium. So a 15-minute break, and please come